All right, it's May 25th, 2018 at 1 p.m. We do have a power problem in Las Vegas, so we do not have video in Las Vegas. Those that are in Las Vegas, you need to call in, or if you are listening and we're planning on being there in person, we're going to attempt to have people call in. Do we have any commission members that are on the phone?
This is Nova. I'm on the phone.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. I'm going to wait a few minutes and we'll try to get those who are present in person in Vegas to call in, and I will start the meeting at that time and take roll call. Moment we're on hold. Las Vegas, are you on the phone yet? Okay, thank you.
For the pounding.
Who just came on the phone?
This is Dawn Throne.
Hi, Dawn. Is Judge Hoskin available too?
You're going to, well, it's not as loud as we would hope. Chuck Hoskin and Karen Cliff are here as well.
Okay. And is it difficult to hear?
Ooh, you got a dial tone with that, huh? Yeah, they've got, yeah, see if we can get that on the speaker, that would be great. We're going to dial in.
We have power problems in Vegas.
We had power problems in Reno on Monday, so.
You know, I hadn't noticed.
That sounds louder than we were hearing before. We'll move over there.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Is it going to be, is the volume going to be sufficient enough to hold the meeting?
Not yet. We got a landline, though, that seems to be working.
Okay.
We're just going to move closer to it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I can hear you. Let me know when you have that landline up, and then we'll test the volume at that point and see if we can hold the meeting or not.
Okay, I'm hanging up on this line.
Okay.
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, we did.
We've already dialed.
Yeah.
Las Vegas, is the volume going to be sufficient?
It should, actually, I'm going to be able to transfer you.
Put it over the...
Into the speaker system.
Oh, that'd be great.
Oh, okay. Oh, good, good.
Oh.
It's not on your...
We make it speaker system, yeah. We're sitting close to the light.
An Assemblyman Picker just showed up.
Yep.
So you guys should be access code,
Yeah,
correct?
so we're connected.
Yes.
Okay, so access
Never
code.
set the important test before.
Okay, Las Vegas, how are we doing on volume?
We're okay now. They're going to try and put it through the speaker system in the room here, so
Okay,
able to hear better. So hold on a second.
okay.
Technical difficulties.
I did not print out anything thinking I could get here and say it. Oh, do that? I asked if we printed out the materials and I was told no. So.
Can I have an
they're on
agenda
it,
too,
though.
please?
Only upon the fire staff training.
Project batteries and that thing. That's firing. What's that? No. It's saying, hey, I have no power.
I still have that.
We know.
We are, unless we somehow are able to deal with it.
I was just running what we talked about with the Illinois adopting some sort of
Yeah, and the case law that I found, probably some of these starts up. The case law I found is essentially a change in the law is a change in service. So it'll floodgates. So I don't know if we can say prospectively do that or not.
yeah.
So, how'd surgery go?
Good. As far as I know, it's not really that painful. So.
How are we doing, Las Vegas?
She was trying to put it over the top.
We're still trying to get it onto the speaker system.
Okay. Just FYI, we can hear you some.
Yeah, we don't.
Okay.
We tried to.
We're trying not to say anything stupid.
Too late.
All right, we can, there's four of us here, and we can hear who want to if we want to go forward.
Okay, if you can hear, then let's take a roll call, see where I'm positive we have a quorum, so we'll at least see if we can get some work done. If it becomes a problem, make sure you give us notice, please. All right, this is the May 25th, 2018, 1 p.m., now 1:10 p.m. meeting, and I'm going to call it to order and take roll call. Kathleen Baker.
Present.
Karen Cliff.
Present.
Ellen Crecilius.
Mark Markovic for Aaron Crecilius.
Senator Farley. Assemblyman Fumo. Judge Hoskin.
Here.
Nova Murray.
Present.
Assemblyman Pickard.
Here?
Judge Robb.
Present.
Senator Roberson. Joseph Sanford.
Here.
Judge Shirley. Justice Stiglitz. Kim Surratt's present. And Don Throne.
Present.
Okay, we have a quorum. We will now
We
move
have
on.
power.
Do what?
Said we may have power. Lights just came on.
Great.
It'll be a while before we can get
Get the video
stuff.
up and running. Okay.
But we'll just keep going.
Okay. At this time, we're going to take public comment. Is there anybody in Las Vegas for public comment?
Nope.
Okay. Anybody on the phone that would like to give public comment? Anybody in Carson City that would like to give public comment? All right. Agenda item closed. We'll move on to agenda item number 3, which is approval of the meeting minutes. Let's start with the meeting minutes from May 4th, 2018. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Motion passes. Approval of meeting minutes from May 16th, 2018, our shortest minutes yet. Do I have a motion?
So moved?
Okay,
Second.
It's second from Judge Rob. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed say nay. Motion passes. All right. Let's move on to agenda item number 4, discussion and recommendations on proposed language for percentages and calculation of child support at varying income levels. And I know Mr. Sanford has provided us with some updated information, and we were all under the directive from the May 4th meeting to play with the spreadsheet and the percentages. Mr. Sanford, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. So at our last meeting, we discussed sort of where we were at with the percentages, and I provided a spreadsheet, kind of gave some graphs on varying percentages that we might choose to go with for different numbers of children. At the last meeting, I also was going to try and gather some comparable numbers using the BR4 method. I looked into that. I really wasn't able to get those numbers correct in a manner that I would find acceptable for putting into the spreadsheet directly. Reading through how those numbers were calculated, it starts as sort of an amount of expenditures that each family would have, and the report that we received from Jane Venor had quite a few steps to change that to net income and then gross income, and made quite a few assumptions in that I wasn't really willing to try to redo myself. So I guess as far as getting additional base information, I would say if we can contact her to get those numbers directly that she used for her graph, that would be quite a bit easier. I did make an attempt to use the graph that she provided, which is exhibits 14, 15, 16 in the report, but they were too loose a scale to really get accurate percentages out of it. It just became sort of $40 or $50 off is the difference between 2-3%, and it ended up making it so that the numbers weren't really very usable. So I guess as far as getting the BR4 numbers, I would like to propose that we contact Ms. Venor directly and get those numbers that she used for her system. As far as the base percentages, I did play with the numbers. I ended up liking sort of the numbers that were presented at the last meeting as being, I think, fairly close to what was provided in the FDA numbers, and those appeared to be at least a good place to start from. So that was, just as a reminder, the 16% for one child and going down to 8 and then 4%, and 2 children 22%, 11%, 6%, 3 children 26%, 13%, 6%, and 4 children 28%, 14%, 7%, with the first threshold at $6,000 income per month, and the second at $10,000 per month. And then I just very quickly this morning was trying to update the base support obligation language to, I guess, make the calculation make more sense. Looking at it now, I see that maybe the numbers I deleted the commas out of, but the idea being that compared to the last language, the language uses the word plus after each A, B, and C to, I guess, clarify for anyone on how you were supposed to be doing the sum of how the first 16% would go for income less than or equal to $6,000, and then the second threshold between $6,000 and $10,000, and the third threshold above $10,000 per month. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Vegas, are you still on the phone with us? Or are we switching to video?
Can you hear us on video?
We can.
We'll
is
move so you
exciting.
can see us.
Okay, that's great. We'd appreciate it.
Keith Pickard for the record. Mr. Sanford, it sounds like I did exactly what you did, and I just tried to eyeball, when I put it in the spreadsheet, tried to just see if it was falling near the BR4 numbers, and I agree the resolution of the exhibits is so poor that you're probably right, $40, $50 off at any given moment. But I'm not sure that we need more precise detail if we're using that information for purposes of determining whether or not our numbers are reasonable. Because if it's falling within the scale, it's a decision we can make as to whether or not it's closely enough aligned between the margins, and I think it is. So I'm personally, after having gone through the same exercise, I am comfortable with the thought that we pick these numbers because they do put us in the range that makes sense.
So this is Kim Surratt. I agree. I'm really happy with the percentages. I'm still looking at our wording on it and thinking to myself, okay, can the average attorney, not even public, are they following us? Do we have it written out right? But I couldn't figure out a different way to write it anyway. So, but I wonder, are we clear? Are we there where the plus makes sense at the end of the sentences? I wonder if we need to run it by some lay people to see what they think. If we just hand it to them, if they get to if they understand that that's what that means, is you add it for those different income values. Mr. Sanford.
On that point, I would say that I did try to run this past a couple of people, and in general, on their first blush, the people, it was about 3/4 got it and 1/4 didn't, which I'm not sure is an acceptable percentage. I did have an example that I would provide afterwards, and after that was very helpful. I don't know that we would want to include that directly in the statute or in the code, but that was how Wisconsin, which is where we took it from, used some examples directly in their administrative regulations so that it would be with it, and I think that would probably be much more effective at conveying the issue, what might be missing than just directly reading the language. So I think that would be something to consider.
Bridget Robb, for the record, I don't think I'd want it in the statute, but is there a problem with having it be a comment?
I don't think it is a problem. In terms of, because we're moving to this being a regulation versus being a statute anymore, and you're right, I had noticed that too. That was one of the first things. I went back to Wisconsin's because I thought, okay, in all of our discussions, how far away did we end up from it and that kind of stuff. And I did notice the examples in there. When it's a regulation and you add a comment, I'm looking at our deputy AG to see if she has any insight on our ability to do that, or footnotes, or right, anything like that.
Senior Deputy Attorney General Amy Crow, I'm not certain, but I can ask some colleagues who have a better sense. I think there's a little more flexibility in the NAC than there is in the NRS. So I can come back at the next committee meeting.
Okay.
I would prefer it not be in any official language, but be in something that would be just helpful, as comments are to statutes. So,
of course, in terms of the DWSS, they're able to give out educational materials to the public, to put that kind of information on the website. We're going to be educating, obviously, as a commission, coming out of this like crazy. But it brings me back to just thinking to myself, okay, if we're at the point where we know we have something written that has to have education behind it, is there any tweaking we can do to get it closer to being clear? If there's any better language that we could use. I couldn't come up with something personally. I was still very happy with this method. I'm mainly happy with it because I think we have a higher duty to getting the numbers right and not overreaching on our calculations than it is to worry about whether or not 100% of the population understands the formula just by reading. We're not going to get 100% ever correct. So, any additional thoughts from the commission on that? Silence. For the record, Judge Shirley's with us now. Sure. I'll entertain a motion.
Move to adopt.
What are we adopting?
Second.
Adopt what?
Be clear on what you're adopting.
A question was, what are we adopting? I would adopt the proposed calculation and percentages as described by Mr. Sanford.
Actually, that was not what I understood I was seconding. We have language here that I'm looking at. Is that what you're proposing to adopt,
What language?
Assemblyman?
All I see is numbers.
Can you point me to a document?
There's language that directly for the NAC, which starts
And
out,
this is
except as set
entitled
forth.
Child support calculations other than low income?
Yes.
Yes, and so I would clarify the motion to adopt the language as described in this document.
Second.
Just so we're clear, that at least the document I'm looking at is still at 1825-29-31, and I think the proposal is
No, there's
16.
a,
Yeah.
staff should have
And
provided
we're
you.
looking at a different document?
Yes.
Thank you.
I don't know that I have that document.
Staff should have a copy for you there from that demonstrates 16%, 8 and 4 for one child, for 2 children, 22, 11, and 6, for 3 children, 26, 13, and 6.
I have a spreadsheet. Is that what you're looking at, Ms.
No.
No, we have the actual spelled out language along with the spreadsheet. We have both. So you're missing the
over there?
document. And it's the same
we don't
language
seem
that
to have
Mr.
it.
Sanford provided to us previously, just with these percentages inputted. And plus is the word plus added.
Correct. And to be fair to staff, I did send this today, so they may not have got it up to Las Vegas. The percentages were changed. After each comma, the word plus was added. The thresholds were changed to the 6,000, 10,000, which matches what was in the spreadsheet instead of originally, I think it was 7,000 and 15,000. And I think that was the only changes made.
And Bridget Robb, for the record, it is those percentages that I seconded.
And those were the percentages I intended to move on. So
Okay.
I reviewed that before I came here today, so I just assumed it was what was handed me. But in any event, that was the intent, because I used those same numbers, and they fell right within the boundaries of the graph. So that was my intent.
Jim Shirley, for the record, I'm struggling a little bit with the language of less than. I wonder if it shouldn't say something to the effect that 16% of the parent's gross monthly income for the first $6,000 plus, and then the other problem is it's not 8% of the entire amount. It would be 8% of the 10,000 or the 6,050 minus the 6,000. So I think that's unclear in the language that we currently have. And then on the third one, it would be anything above 10,000. So you're getting, it's 8% of whatever the overage over 6% is and whatever the overage is over the 10,000. My concern is the way it reads right now, you'd charge the 8, you charge the 16 plus an additional 8 on the entire income, the way it currently reads. And I understand that's not the intent, but
Go ahead, Judge Rob.
This is Bridget Robb for the record. That, Judge Shirley, is not how I read this. I read this to be, and equal to, less than or equal to is a phrasing that is a little awkward as far as what legal documents usually do. They usually say equal to or less than. But that doesn't trouble me much. But it has the threshold of $6,000. And then it says the gross income from 6,001 to 10,000. I don't know how we would tighten that up any better.
I'm not coming up with a proposal. I can just see some ambiguity there that maybe we can clarify. I'm fine with the percentages. I'm fine with the amounts. I'm fine with all that. I'm just wondering if there isn't some language to remove some of the ambiguity there.
Keith Pickard for the record. I wonder if we were to say 10% of the portion of the parent's gross monthly income between 6,001 and you know, so we talk about it in terms of the portion of gross monthly income. I see the judge's point, and it's well taken.
I think it was part of my concern, though, at the beginning. To me, it looks clear on the paper, but then when I think about how other people can read this, that's the exact ambiguity that's there. It's, do they understand to take those three things and add them together and only do the percentage of each of those brackets?
Which is why I think examples would be so helpful.
Yeah, the examples help a lot. Assemblyman Pickard, your suggestion was 16% of the portion. Is that the word you used?
It would be 16% of a parent's gross monthly income. Well, yeah.
Maybe under B, you put the word portion,
I just stumbled
right?
over less, which I hadn't stumbled over before. So it'd be up to and including $6,000, 10% of the portion of the parent's gross monthly income between 6,001 and whatever the high number was, 15,000, plus 5% of the portion of the parent's gross monthly income in excess of 15,000.
Okay, you've got the old. Do we
Yeah,
have the
I'm
ability
looking
to
at
get
the
the
old
correct
one.
document in front of them in Vegas?
Well, I'm trying to call it up.
Okay.
I'm trying to do two things at once.
Joy's looking into it for us. We can't operate.
Staff is indicating they're trying to get it printed now.
Okay, thank you. It's really hard to operate without you guys having the right document, but you have the right spreadsheet. So if we look at the spreadsheet, it's about, the spreadsheet makes sense. That's pretty darn clear. The issue is, how do we get, how do we get that conveyed into language, into words?
And to be clear, I like Judge Shirley again, I like the concept of what's down in the words. I think it just could be cleaned up some so it spells it out correctly. I like the idea of an example or a comment like we do with the rules of professional conduct or the judicial code of conduct, those type of things. But it seems to me that the language is still awkward. And I'm wondering if we couldn't work on we can approve the concept and the numbers, but work on the concept of what the language should say to get us where we need to be.
Keith Pickard for the record. we be better off then adopting the percentages and the concept, and then not necessarily adopting language and allow that to occur as part of the holistic compilation of the entire regulation?
Meaning we let LCB figure out how to write it for us, and we tell them what we want?
Yes.
Yes, that is their job. I tend to agree with that statement.
I will simply amend my motion to adopt the percentages as outlined in today's document, the 16, 8, and 4, and the thresholds of 6,000 and 10,000, subject to final approval of language after LCB draft.
Can I throw a wrench in while we're at it?
Yes.
I wasn't at the last two meetings, but in reading the minutes from May 4, there was still a question with regard to the gross monthly income definition. I'm concerned that...
And we do have that as an agenda item.
Right,
Well,
I
we
saw
have
that.
it as an agenda item within the terms of the scope of the committee's authority, and
Right.
also in dealing with the medical insurance issue.
But since we're now proposing to make a determination that 16 is the right amount to start with, that number may change depending on what we do with the gross monthly income definition. Where it may, Exhibit 14 indicates that we're in that range, but we're talking about gross monthly income as we typically define gross monthly income rather than as we may end up defining it down the road. So I'm not sure that I'm in a position to agree to the percentage amounts based upon gross monthly income if I don't know what gross monthly income is as of yet.
Keith Picker for the record. Just a question. We're talking about whether or not we're going to be including child care and insurance expenses. Is that right?
My recollection is that we'd already made that determination and voted on it. So I was a little surprised with the minutes from the May 4th hearing or meeting. But if it's still up for discussion, then I'd like to know how we're defining gross monthly income so we make sure that we're in the right percentage framework to make sure we've got a right-sized order. So that's my only concern with voting on the percentages at this point before we know what we're going to call gross monthly income.
Keith Picker for the record. I agree. I guess I had thought that we had adopted the definition of gross monthly income that Judge Hoskin had drafted several meetings ago. I know there was some discussion about whether or not that included, but I thought that we had agreed that the language of the prior proposal that had been adopted was what we were going to stick with. So, Madam Chair, maybe you know, because since you're tracking this.
The issue that arose that we still had not, we had agreed to the definition of gross monthly income. We had still tabled the issue of defining the difference between when the payor is also the payor of the insurance versus the payee being the one that was paying the insurance, and how to deal with that, because it's one thing when you're paying child support and your gross monthly income is adjusted because you're also paying the health insurance, but we never decided what to do when the other party who was receiving the child support was the one paying the health insurance, and how to deal with that within the calculation. So we still had a big hole when it came to that circumstance. Does that make sense? I mean, are you tracking me? I'm trying to see your face,
Yes.
but I can't see your face, Judge.
No, that's how I remember.
Okay.
We'd kind of come up with a definition, but we were still holding out to decide what to do on that other side of it.
On the other side of it. And so that came up as an issue because it's still the part that a lot of people struggle with on the fairness part of it. It seems to make sense on the obligor is also the payor of the insurance and your gross monthly income being reduced in that circumstance. It just.
Correct. And with my concern with what we're proposing to vote on right now is simply considering the obligor side of it. If we're going to deduct childcare and health care off the obligor's gross monthly income, is 16% the right number? And I don't know that we've looked at it from that standpoint. At least maybe you guys did in the last couple of meetings, but I don't recall that we've said, compared with Exhibit 14, that at least that I'm looking at.
I contemplated it
something
in the
we've considered?
percentages in my head because I also was thinking to myself, well, if you take it off of your gross monthly income and then you calculate your child support, you're not getting a dollar for dollar credit, obviously, because it's a percentage credit for the insurance that you're paying, right? So even though it drops you even further down below the FDA numbers, you're still paying the full insurance bill. So
And
it
maybe
seems,
then some.
and then maybe some, and then some. Yeah, you're not getting that full half credit. And we had
Right.
left out there in the wind whether or not half of the cost of the medical insurance comes off your gross monthly income or the full amount of the health insurance comes off your gross monthly income. I don't think it's
Correct.
fair at half because you're still only getting a percentage, of your of credit for that. You're not getting
Right.
the full amount credit. It's just whether or not that's fair versus, and that's where we started to spin again in dealing with the percentages, even though we had decided we liked it being part of the gross monthly income definition, we also started to struggle with, all right, but when we look at these, when the percentages play out, is it fair versus actually doing a deviation based on exactly half?
Yeah, which I
Right.
think is still my concern in deciding that 16, in running it in my head, 16 seems too high if we're giving them an offset for the amount. And again, it's not dollar for dollar, and we have to consider that going in. And if it's half or all, I'm still on the side of I think it should be all if that's the definition we're going with, and then deal with the other side, the obligees, out-of-pocket costs for those expenses as well separately from that. But and maybe you've said, I thought you indicated maybe you've run it with those numbers in mind and feel more comfortable with the 16, but I hadn't done it that way. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page and we know what gross monthly income is before we decide that 16% is the appropriate amount for one child. That's what I'm suggesting.
I still felt comfortable because they still weren't getting, the part that may be uncomfortable, they still weren't getting a benefit worth half the value of the medical insurance. So it didn't, if the payor of the child support, or the obligor of the child support was also the payor of the insurance, and you took 100% of the insurance off of the gross monthly income and then calculated the child support, it didn't come out to a benefit to them of even half the value of the medical insurance. So even though, it dropped them down on the scale a little bit on child support, it wasn't a benefit that was significant, half the insurance worth of a benefit. Which is why I didn't mind, the 16% still seemed like it was fine. The issue to me was twofold. One was, do we do half or all of the insurance? In my opinion, we do all of it off of the gross monthly income. But then the second question is, do we take it off of gross monthly income or do we go back to the deviation? And that's where we started to spin at that meeting on May 4th.
And I know that the reason we tried to do this is Bridget Robb for the record. I know the reason we tried to do this was to get away from the idea of deviations, because this deviation happens in virtually every child support calculation that's done. But I'm with Judge Hoskin. I'm kind of looking at this thinking it doesn't seem to be fair if one party is paying the entire amount but isn't getting the benefit of the entire amount. Although I think we have striven mightily to try and get away from the deviation idea, I think I actually like the way it worked and the way it works right now, where we figure it out based on percentages and then divide up who has the insurance and what the cost is, because we cannot, and in most circumstances, I don't want to, if people have private insurance, I want them to be able to look at that private insurance between the two of them, figure out who's got the best bang for their buck. And
do the right thing.
whoever has it is the person who carries the insurance, and the other party either pays more in child support because of the one half or gets a deviation down because of the one half. We've really struggled with this concept, and I think we're struggling with it because we just can't get to a place that's fair from a place that I think was already pretty fair. And so I would suggest we maybe jettison this and go back to a definition of gross monthly income that doesn't include the deductions for either child support or insurance, and that we go back to having the parties share that after child support has been established.
I took that
Keith
same.
Pickard for the record.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's my recollection, I haven't pulled it up, but it's my recollection that the definition already, the one that Judge Hoskin proposed, does not currently carve out or specifically include the insurance and whatnot. My feeling, and I thought that we had agreed to this, but apparently not. But what was in my head was that we were going to call, or we were going to take this in steps. We start with the percentage calculation, we figure that out. Then step 2 was to consider an equitable amount or an equitable division of the costs of insurance and child care. And those were separate parts of the calculation and not technically then a deviation factor to be calculated independent of the calculation. And by doing that, I thought we were going to be consistent with the federal requirement or the desire to reduce the number and magnitude of the deviations themselves. And so my thought was we start with the definition that Judge Hoskin has created for the gross monthly income. We apply this calculation with the 16, 8, and 4, and then that gives us the first number. Step 2, we consider the costs of insurance and child care as applicable, and then step 3 would be any other deviations that are equitable under the circumstances. So that's kind of how I had it in my mind. So if that's accurate, if my recollection is accurate, then we stay with the decision we made before as to the definition of gross monthly income. We adopt these calculations, this percentage and thresholds as part of that first step. And then we reserve the contemplation or the determination as to an equitable division of the insurance and child care as a separate step in the process.
True, but when you make the statement that we go with the definition of gross monthly income, we had moved support, childcare, and health insurance around, and at the very, very moment, based on motions, it's within the definition of gross monthly income. So it's not quite accurate to say we go with.
We had agreed to the one without, so
There
that's
you go.
my mistake. Okay.
Yeah, and we have our senior deputy AG at the table. If it's regarding the scope of our authority, we do have it as an agenda item, and I have a complete response and discussion I want to have with you on the record on that.
Okay.
Under that agenda
was,
item.
Actually, I just wanted to mention that was part of the discussion from May 4th that Judge Hoskins
Correct.
referenced. Okay.
Okay, perfect. So, I would agree with that approach, Assemblyman Pickard. I know it was motions and decisions we made to put that into that gross monthly income definition, but I do think at this point, based on playing with these numbers, I am far more comfortable doing it the way you just stated. It's not a deviation, but it is that next step of the calculation, that has to take place so that it's a must and part of the calculating versus a deviation that the court has discretion over.
And that was my discomfort, Assemblyman Pickard. This is Bridget Robb for the record. I was having difficulty removing that particular number from gross monthly income and then applying the percentages. If we use the process that you just suggested, I am far more comfortable.
All right, so since, and Keith Pickard for the record, since I just pulled up the gross monthly income definition, and it does in fact, and so I apologize for that. So I suppose we need to, well, do we want to withdraw the existing motion and reconsider the motion on the gross income? Do we want to vote on the percentages, essentially vote on the motion that I just made with the expectation of reconsidering the decision on gross monthly income? But I think one or the other, we're going to have to reconsider the definition of gross monthly income so we can remove the line items B and C of
Okay, so let's back.
Section 12.
Yeah, let's back into it for a second. We did not do a vote on those percentages because we went into
Right, so
discussion.
we either need to remove or we need to either withdraw it or move forward.
Correct. Or, well, I think you could still, we could proceed on that motion, and then we just need to move on to additional motions regarding the issue of the definition of gross monthly income, which
Right.
agenda-wise,
I believe that
is still appropriate within this conversation. We do have a different agenda item for the childcare and healthcare expenses. Part of the calculation, we could do it under that agenda item also.
this is Bridget Robb for the record. I think we need to do the reconsideration first. And if I understand my Robert's rules correctly, the person who made the motion has to request the reconsideration. Do we know who made the motion?
Well, if we do that, then I need to withdraw the existing motion. If we reconsider first,
Yes.
because we have a motion on the table. So I'll go ahead and withdraw that, Madam Chair, and then we can move forward.
And you were the second on it, Judge
I was.
Ross?
No objection.
Okay, so no objection to his withdrawing that motion. So we're starting from a clean slate right now. And we will work off of, let's break this into pieces, would be my recommendation. Let's start with the definition of gross monthly income and what motion needs to be made on that.
Madam Chair, this is Joe Sanford.
Yes.
I'll make a motion that we strike subsection 13 of the definition of gross monthly income, which states the following shall be deducted prior to determining gross monthly income for the purposes of calculating child support. A, the reasonable cost of, and then possibly 1/2 child care for the subject children, and B, the reasonable cost of 1/2 the health care for the subject children.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
Just so we're at least maintaining this the way that we got here. The reason that we decided to add that language in is because we wanted to deal with it on the front end rather than the back end and get rid of those adjustments / deviations at that point in time in eliminating that. And I'm not opposed to eliminating it. I wasn't a big fan of sticking it to begin with because I'm a big fan of deviations. So just because I
Correct,
wrote
but we're
it
not
doesn't
going to
mean
call
that
it a
I'm stuck with it.
deviation. We're working along the lines of moving it to still part of the calculation, but you're going to calculate support first, and then you're going to determine either an addition or a deduction to that support amount, and it's going to be a must once we get to that part. Right now, we're
Right,
just
and
working
my
on.
recollection.
Correct.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. Yeah, my recollection is that we've already been down this path. We had this discussion, and we wanted to deal with it at the front end rather than in the second or third stage. So
We
I
did,
feel like
but we
we're going-
also held on to the fact that we didn't know our percentages very well yet, and Hen looked at it in comparison to the FDA numbers, and now, me personally, I'm more comfortable with it being the third step than I am with it being in the definition of gross monthly income.
Actually, what
Just-
we would
and-
have,
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Judge.
what we would have, if I'm looking at this correctly, is we would have a three-part formula that deals with just the number for the child support, and then two additional parts of the formula as opposed to deviations. One that would deal with the cost of insurance, and the second that would deal with the cost of childcare. And I think when we were looking at adding it to the gross income and deducting it on the front end, Judge Hoskin, I had not contemplated the idea that that wouldn't be fair to the payor's parent, that the obligor wouldn't get full credit for the amount of insurance or child care that they were paying for. And so I kind of like doing this better because I think it number one, is more transparent as to those numbers, and number two, it is fairer, I think, to the party who's going to end up paying child support because they're getting the full deduction as opposed to just a portion of it. And I hadn't recognized that it wasn't going to be dollar for dollar when we were first contemplating this.
And I don't disagree with anything you just said, which is the reason I left half versus whole in, because I had some concerns with regard to the fairness factor going in. I just want us to be clear that we're kind of going back to where we were before and maybe making it more complex than we intended to make it at some point in time. Not saying that I disagree with taking it off the front end. I think it's cleaner and easier to deal with if we deal with it as an adjustment factor at some point. But the fact that we're creating about 3 or 4 steps in order to calculate child support also concerns me a little bit with regard to the ease or simplicity for pro per litigants.
I think once they get used to the first 3 steps, the second 2 steps shouldn't trouble them at all. I don't think we're developing a Malmquist formula. I think we'll be okay.
Karen Cliff, Clark County
Yes.
DAs. Just going back to Mr. Sanford's proposal that we remove Section 13, any thoughts on just changing the language? You could just state the following shall be considered for purposes of calculating child support. I mean, I'm open to removing it too, but
It's in the definition of gross monthly income.
yeah.
I think they're talking about moving it.
Oh, you want to move it? Okay. Disregard.
Yeah, I almost feel like at the beginning of gross monthly or gross income definition, we just say, step 1, determine gross monthly income. I mean, I know that sounds very basic, but I feel like that's what we need to be doing. Step 2, move, right? Okay, see, I didn't think I was that crazy.
I think at the example, that's exactly what we should do.
But the motion that we are dealing with at this very moment was the motion to strike Section 13 of the gross income definition with the language, the following shall be deducted prior to determining, and oh yeah, Section B. So it's 13A and B. That's really a different section. You're right. Okay. And we had a second. And we had discussion. Is there any additional discussion? Hearing none. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay. Motion passes. Now, with that, do we have a motion for step number 2, which would be the percentages for high income? We haven't discussed low income yet. We'll do that in a second, because Ellen did create a new chart for us on that.
This, Joe Sanford, I
Senator
just want to
Pickard.
clarify that it's not just high income. This would be all income except for low income.
Right. All income except for income under 1,518, correct?
I'll make that motion.
That might change with time, yeah, but
I'll
Second.
make that motion, just to be clear that the motion is for the non-low income, as outlined in today's proposal, using the 6, 8, and 4%, and the 6,000 and
16.
10,000 thresholds.
not 6.
I'm sorry, 16, 8, and 4% with the 6,000 and 10,000 threshold.
Okay, second.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor, state aye.
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 Opposed, state nay. Motion passes. Let's discuss the new low-income chart from Ellen, and I believe we have a motion and a vote already to accept this methodology for the low income. It's just that she made an adjustment for us to the threshold being 16%, based on the potential that today we would be okay with that being our threshold amount. And I don't, unless anybody feels differently on the commission, believe it requires a vote, because we already adopted the calculation, which was on that sheet, which is the income, that's 75% of the monthly poverty level income for a one-person household. And then she went out from there, utilizing the percentage of 16% as the threshold. Now, I do want to check one thing, 26, 20, and the percentages match on her chart, 16, 22, 26, 28. Her chart does go out to 5 children, which is appropriate, but it was just an additional 2% because that's how we have it set out. Does anybody feel that I am incorrect and that we do need a motion or anything different on this?
Our deputy AG may want to opine, but we can also just move to affirm it.
We could. Do you want to make that motion?
So moved.
Seconded.
Judge Shirley seconds. Any discussion? All
This
those.
is Karen from the Clark County
Yes.
DA's office. Just to confirm, because this is based on the 2018 federal poverty guidelines, just to clarify, will we receive a new chart every year? Will this be implemented into the regs?
We did do some language on low income before. Let me look at it, that we had approved before. And we had put in that language that we had approved prior, that the schedule shall be approved by the commission no later than January 31st of each year and shall be published by the administrative office of the courts. So we contemplated in our prior language that we would update it yearly.
Just to clarify, so what this does is creates for one child an $80 minimum.
No, we need to discuss that if that's what we are going to do, but on this chart at the moment, because
says
courts
up
still
to.
will have deviation authority. Yes, it stops at $80 on this chart, but that doesn't mean the court couldn't deviate below that, and we still have on our agenda to discuss if we're going to set
Okay.
a dead minimum and what
I
it's
just
going to
didn't know
be.
if I didn't know if we'd gone down that path with regard to that's as far down as we get to go.
I put it
because
back
this
on the
says up
agenda
to
so we could
700.
discuss that, yeah.
Okay, all right. Then I'm fine with it.
Okay. We had a motion to affirm and a second, and discussion. All in favor state aye.
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 Anybody opposed? All right, motion passes. Now, the next step would be step number 3, which would be to reinstitute the third step of calculating medical insurance and childcare expenses. And the flavor from the commission that I was hearing is that we are entertaining just when we already have the nice language we did on medical support, and childcare from our prior meetings, but the issue would be to bring it back in and state specifically that each parent is responsible for 50%, and that after child support's calculated, that we would then either increase that child support amount or decrease it by dependent on who is the payor of that expense. Correct?
As I remember it, the current language says, absent extraordinary circumstances, the parties will share 50-50 the insurance. I like the extraordinary circumstances because then if there is a reason for one party or the other to maintain all of that cost or the majority of that cost, it gives the court discretion to do that.
Keith Pickard for the record. I agree that we probably should have some trigger like that. Extraordinary circumstances, to me, though, is a pretty high burden. So if we may want to consider things like significant disparity of income. If somebody's making $20,000, the other's making $5,000, is that enough? We probably ought to define that if we're going to, for purposes of this calculation, if we're going to include it.
The language we had from the medical support language from prior meetings was the cost of medical support shall be borne equally by the parents, with each parent being responsible for 50% of the cost of medical support unless, comma, in extraordinary circumstances, comma, the court determines that a basis exists to deviate from the parents equally sharing the cost of medical support. I don't know if I want to define it. Does anybody, is there an appetite for that from anybody else?
What I thought we talked about, well, several times we've talked about reasonable cost to kind of give the court an ability to step in and say that you're spending too much for health insurance rather than, and I know reasonable was in the gross monthly definition rather than in the offset.
Yes. Well, that definition, whether or not it's reasonable, is still that 5% of the gross monthly income of the parent language. That's still in here. And that was a need. We had a need for that, especially for the 4D cases. As used in this section, medical support includes, without limitation, the cost of coverage for medical, vision, and dental under a plan of insurance for the child that is reasonable in cost and accessible, meaning the payment of the premium. And if we drop down, says, for the purpose of this subsection, payments of cash for medical support or the cost of coverage for health care under a plan of insurance are reasonable in cost if, in the case of payments of case for, oh, there's a typo there. In case of payments for medical support, the cost to each parent who is responsible for providing medical support is not more than 5% of the gross monthly income of the parent. That's just to determine if it's reasonable. That doesn't say they only have to pay 5% of it, just whether or not it was a reasonable cost. So that language is there. But the issue that Mr. Pickard brought up was whether or not we need to define extraordinary circumstances, because you felt like it was that's a very high burden. I personally think the court can decide on its own. I mean, I don't know that you want to get into a whole bunch of defining different times when you're going to adjust child support and listing out specifically what's an extraordinary circumstance. But other
Keith
thoughts?
Pickard for the record. I tend to agree with you because I like discretion in the court. I'm just thinking back to the 2015 bill where we inserted the words meaningful relationship. And even though that existed elsewhere, I had many comments about a lack of clear definition. So my thought was simply along those same lines.
Assemblyman Pickard, this is Bridget Robb for the record. That language has existed previously in the statute, and we've all dealt with it. The circumstance that you just suggested, where we have one parent who makes significantly more than the other parent. That's something that I have dealt with as an extraordinary circumstance in the past. So the problem I always find is if we over-define things, then people think that's the laundry list and that's it. And I would prefer to give judges and parties the ability to use this discretion when it's appropriate, rather than define the areas where we think it's appropriate, because I've never been able to contemplate all of the circumstances that might exist.
Keith Pickford for the record. I actually do agree with you. But that's probably because you and I must have a similar thought when it comes to extraordinary circumstances. And and again, my comment was simply generated by the recollection of what happened after the prior lack of clear definition. So that was it. And if everybody thinks the way, if all the judges thinks the way you do, then we're in great shape.
Judge Shirley does not disagree. We confirmed. Okay. Then, that's medical support. And that is the language we had previously. That's in the in defining it. We had never really changed any of that language. We had made a motion on it. We just were still messing around with it in gross monthly income. So I think we're okay on that language. I did see a typo in it. When we do the our next meeting, when we do the master document, I'll come in with the typo edit on that.
This is Dawn Throne.
Yes.
I think we also had talked about we need to add, there's missing language to say specifically to add half to the payors if the non-payer is paying it, or deduct. That specific language is not there.
Yeah, because it does just say they're 50% responsible. So you're right, we don't have it converted into that actual calculation language. It would make sense to do it. It's kind of like what I said, where we almost need that calculation language at the front of gross income, where it says, step number 1 for determining child support, determine the gross monthly income. Step number 2. Okay, so why don't I will, actually, Dawn, do you want to do that? Because you worked on this medical language, didn't you?
Yes,
Yes.
that's fine. I can do that.
Okay. So we will table it for the next meeting for you to come in with more of a calculation language to add to the front end of the medical support. Then the next step would be to determine what we're going to do now that we removed childcare from the gross monthly income language. It's still listed in our adjustments because we stopped calling them deviations, but as the cost of childcare. We're right back to square one on childcare again. Are we going to do the same 50-50 like we're doing on medical support as the third step to calculating child support?
That's where reasonableness really.
It would be my preference to change it from a 50-50 to an equitable division, because I think that, at least in my experience, there have been arguments to be made in many cases, and those arguments are ignored because our practice is to divide them 50-50 despite difference in income, except for one department in the South that tends to like to do things on a proportionate share. So I would personally prefer saying an equitable division, but I'm not stuck on that.
Other thoughts?
Judge, yeah.
Joseph?
Judge Hoskin,
Oh.
yeah, although it's simpler to simply say let's divide it, there are so many circumstances where an equal division of the child care cost doesn't make any sense for their factual scenarios. So, like I said earlier, I'm a big proponent of putting it on the back end, letting the court deal with it, but I understand we're kind of trying to move away from that. There are some circumstances where I don't think the court should consider child care at all. But it's
But would
something
you say
that
they
we've been
shouldn't
mandated.
consider it, or, I mean, because you still want them to
No, that-
at least
you're
say,
right.
okay, I thought about it, and yeah, I'm not going to
Shouldn't
change.
deduct for
Right,
it.
okay.
Not shouldn't consider it, shouldn't deduct for it. And there are those circumstances that come into play, and there's so many unique situations with regard to child care that I think we would be hard pressed to do something that's going to be universally applicable for every scenario, based upon the fact that there's so many different ways of dealing with it, from grandma's watching the kid for free to I'm sending them down to somebody's daycare for $1,000, $1,500 a month. How do you cover that range with a reg, is my question.
This is Karen Cliff from the Clark County DAs. Just in terms of weighing in terms of our caseload and our population, my position is that we leave it in the determination of gross monthly income as a consideration, but we don't provide a formula. We don't mandate whether it's 50, a third. We just leave it to the discretion of the court.
This is Bridget Robb for the record. That's why I liked Assemblyman Pickard's suggestion, and so I am paying the compliment back to you, Assemblyman. I am agreeing with you right now. I think that an equitable division, if any, makes complete sense.
So this is Kim Surratt.
Thank you,
I think
Judge Robb,
within
and
the
I'll
gross
second that one.
income definition, we had it that it shall be deducted from the gross monthly income before calculating. So I don't necessarily agree it stays in the gross income definition. I think we are still in a better place than how we used to have our statute. If we state as step number 4, after you determine health insurance, this is how you divide it, that you state as the next step that childcare must be considered, and that the court make an equitable division. That's still a specific statement of how it is to be dealt with, versus that it may be considered as the list of deviations and adjustments that we had before. It still says to the courts, we think it's important, you need to look at it, it must be considered. Whether it's, how it's divided, though, is up to the court to do equitably in its own discretion, before you just go into the list of, the court may consider all these other things for a deviation after the fact. It's still a very specific step in the process.
And that's exactly what I was proposing.
Okay. Do you want to propose language for that, Assemblyman Pickard?
I have just been yet again corrected by Judge Hoskin. I need to stay away from the superlatives. So it wasn't exactly what I proposed. But yes, I will move that we adopt that language. That we adopt the language for an equitable division, if any.
Second.
Any discussion?
Is it
Yes.
must consider? Is that part of what we're moving here? Because I think that solves, well, I hope that solves the problem that we were running into with regard to the may language or the deviation language, for want of a better term. And if the court must consider it and apply whatever equitable provisions, then I'm okay with that. I just didn't hear that in the motion.
What he said.
I accept that as well.
Okay. So yes, to confirm, it's a must and it's an equitable division. Okay. All in
any.
favor?
And
Aye.
reasonable.
Aye. And reasonable? Well, at this point, we need to get actual language drafted up so that we can make a motion on the language once it's drafted anyways. We at least agreed and made a motion and voted on the direction of that language. And Assemblyman Pickard, are you going to draft that language?
I can do that.
Okay. Okay. So, let me look at my agenda real quick and see.
Make it exactly the way you state.
So the last part of the calculation language would be the list of adjustments. Which were our prior deviations. And in our prior language that we had, we've never made a vote on this language, actually. This was just the language that was, quote unquote, left over from our prior deviation language that got deleted out of the statute and that I didn't want it to disappear on us. In that language, one of the factors was the cost of childcare. So I am going to propose that out of the adjustments, which are really the deviations, the last things that the court may consider to make additional adjustments to child support, that we take out the cost of childcare. And my motion would be that the remaining items, not motion yet, let me take that language back. The discussion I want to have with everybody is the remaining factors are any special educational needs of the child, the legal responsibility of the parents for the support of others, the value of services contributed by either parent, which is something I wouldn't mind us having a discussion about that language. Any public assistance paid to support the child, including Social Security benefits available to the child, which we dealt with that within the definition of gross monthly income. So I would probably, my proposal might be that be deleted out now. The cost of transportation of the child to and from visitation if the custodial parent moved with the child from the jurisdiction of the court which ordered the support and the non-custodial parent remained. That language happened through one of our meetings. And any other necessary expense for the benefit of the child and the relative income of both parents. Let's talk first.
Can I?
Yes, Judge.
Maybe I wasn't at the meeting where we talked about the relocation, but it sounds like we can't make an adjustment if it goes the other way. If the custodial parent leaves and the non-custodial parent stays, we can't adjust for transportation?
I am troubled.
Did I hear that wrong?
No, Judge Hoskin, this is Bridget Robb for the record. I think you heard it exactly right, and I am troubled by the unilateral nature of that portion. I'd like to make it more, I'd like it mutual.
Yeah, I think that we can get rid of a lot of that language and just say that the court can consider if one or the other party relocates,
Yeah, so my suggestion would be the language just be the cost of transportation of the child to and from visitation. Because it's a deviation factor for that the court may adjust child support, and then that covers both, all different angles.
Well, and at least in Washoe County, if one parent lives in Gerlach and the other parent lives in Reno, there's still going to be some transportation costs. And sometimes those can be significant. So if we take out of the jurisdiction, are you removing that? Then I'm happy.
I was suggesting changing it to just the cost of transportation of the child to and from visitation.
Perfect. That works.
Is anybody else, the value of services contributed by either parent? Anybody else?
What does that mean?
I don't know, but it's been in our deviation factors, and it's a strange beast.
I always took that to mean, Judge, that, for example, if it's not your custodial time, but the other party's working, and you are providing additional care for the children, that's something that could be taken into account. Other than that, I don't know what services means, and I've been afraid to ask.
Which is why I asked Madam Chair rather than you.
Oh, I didn't create that language. It's something that was, hey, it technically got deleted out of the statute by the replacement with our regs, and so if we don't put it back in, it never makes it back in. That's kind of the the point I want to make.
Yeah, if somebody has a better understanding of how that could be applied, And I understand Judge Rob's utilization of that, but it seems to be something that somebody had an idea of what it should mean at some point, but I don't know that we've ever used it. It's like, there's, well, I won't get into it because Assemblyman Pickard's here, but something with child custody that I've never quite understood, so.
Anybody else?
I'm going to pass on that opportunity.
All right, so in formulating what this list is going to be, and this is where, what I think will happen from this is we discuss these in detail here. I'll rewrite the language on what the deviation factors are going to be so I can bring it back, and all I'm going to do is take the input of this conversation to create some language that I bring back for us to discuss and actually do a motion on at one of the subsequent meetings. So I'm of the position that that language be removed.
This is Joe Sanford for the record. The only possible experience I think I've had with that language is stay-at-home parents, where if they were to get a job would be sort of minimum wage and about essentially cover the same cost as childcare. And the idea was that you wouldn't want to incentivize someone to go get a equally paying job so that they can get more in child support when you consider the child care costs in addition. And that, I think that's the only time I've ever seen that used.
So would deleting it cause unintended consequences, potentially? Is it safer just to have it there than to get rid of it?
For the record, I forget the Supreme Court case, but there's a case on this point that talks about the balancing, the idea of a stay-at-home mom giving up that position and going to work. And so they contemplate that value. I forget the case.
I know what case you're talking about. I just can't remember. Was this the factor they used, though, for that analysis?
No.
No, I didn't think so
And that
either.
was going to be my point.
That's an imputed income type argument.
That's
where
correct.
that. That's what that case is about.
That's correct. The voluntary underemployment case, or one of them, as I recall. But yeah, I don't believe that was that the Supreme Court pointed to this when they were talking about that. That was going to be my point.
Is there a catch-all at the end?
No, but we could add one.
Just any other reasonable consideration.
The bar will hate us.
Throw some words in there. Yeah, I'm just saying that if you throw a catch-all in there, I think you can take out the services.
This is Dawn Throne. I think G is more of a catch-all. Any other necessary expenses for the benefit of the child gives a lot of discretion to judges of what's necessary for a child. But I'm thinking more special needs cases where they might need a higher level of care.
Yeah, and there is in this list any special educational needs of the child, but we didn't have just special, well, the special needs of the child I would always put under that necessary expenses.
That would be in G.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, other thoughts on a catch-all? You want me to stay on
Keith
the
Picker
record?
for the
what you
record.
just
I
said?
think G is the catch-all.
I think it is.
I think it is too.
Any other necessary expenses for the benefit of the child.
Okay, so we're back to what's the gut on deleting the value of services contributed by either parent versus leaving it?
Is there anyone that would object to that removal? I don't hear any
Anybody
here.
that wants to keep it?
This is Karen Cliff from the DA's office. I've seen it used in two situations. One of them was the situation that Judge Robb noted, which is when you have a non-custodial parent that has custody of the child, let's say 2 days a month. It affords the hearing master some ability to give a deviation for those 2 or 3 days a month. It doesn't quite equal anything regarding a change of custody, but it's just enough that the value of that individual's services is considered. the majority of times I see it, at least in Clark County, is, and this will no longer be an issue, it's when parties want to deviate from the statutory formula because of some sort of agreement, but the numbers don't make sense. 18% of non-custodial parents' income might be this, but petitioner's willing to accept this. So to make that work, it's been kind of, used, but with Ms. Baker's new regulation regarding giving the parties the freedom to enter into an agreement, I don't see us using that catch-all all that often. So at least in my mind, the only reason it might be used is kind of like what Judge Rob had said. I've seen it used just to deviate for that timeshare adjust.
So, Ms. Cliff, would you err on the side of leaving it in just for those special circumstances or taking it out?
Well, I guess I defer to some of the judges on this panel in terms of, is there another way they've been using that in terms of a non-custodial parent who has custody 2, 3, 4 days a month? What do you use for the non-custodial parent that has less than 40%? What sort of consideration are we able to give absent any formula that changes the custody scenario? How do we give that non-custodial parent credit for timeshare? Well, let's say it's 2 or 3 days a month. Do you just not give them anything? Because, and I say this only, and I'm not advocating one way or the other. We do have individuals, at least in our program, that quite a few that will be on this low-income payer chart, quite a lot actually. And so you are going to have individuals that are probably grossing $1,000 a month, but they do see the child 1 or 2 days per week, whether it's picking them up at school. So it does afford the hearing masters and the judges some ability to manipulate the support amount. I'm not advocating one way or the other, and if we remove it, I would be fine with that, because I defer to the judges on this panel who obviously have figured out another way.
We were all a bit flummoxed by the language, but have used it, and there have been a couple of different, I think, good faith reasons that have been expressed to use it. I think I would prefer to leave it rather than take it out, just because I truly believe I'm not smart enough to contemplate all the circumstances that might arise where it would be useful.
I think out of pure fear of unintended consequences, I'm on the edge of just leave it in. I've seen too much going to the legislature and watching problems come out of it that you didn't think were going to be a problem, and they were, and I don't think it harms anything keeping it there. What was
the
that?
Next go around, we could consider.
Next go around, we can consider it.
We
Yeah,
can
exactly.
always reconsider.
All right.
You've just effectively offended all the legislators in the room, so.
Yeah, I know. It's the beauty of us not being a legislative body on this commission. And there's only one there, right? Or did Roberson show up?
Sorry, Madam Chair, I meant to, he was here before we took our first vote, so the record should probably reflect that.
Let's reflect that Senator Roberson is here. Okay, the other factor that I wanted to decide if we need to keep it in there as a deviation factor, there was any public assistance paid to support the child, including Social Security benefits available to the child. We had a lot of Social Security discussions within gross monthly income, or the definition of gross monthly income. And we did make some adjustments to that language. Of course, that is the income of the parent versus this is specifically public assistance paid to support the child. Do we leave it in as a deviation factor?
I would vote to leave it in simply because if the child is being supported by a Social Security benefit that's not part of the respondent's gross monthly income, in other words, let's say it's an SSI child. So that's the way sometimes it's used right now. The child is receiving SSI. It's of no benefit through the respondent's income, so it never falls into the criteria of a consideration in terms of gross monthly income, but it's been considered a deviation factor because the child is receiving some level of support. Or maybe the child has a parent that is deceased and they are receiving survivor's benefits. So the cost to raise a child is suddenly implicated, right? So would 16% of respondents' income necessarily be needed when the child is receiving these other sources of income? So I would support leaving it, also based on unintended consequences as well.
Okay. Any
I agree
additional
with that.
comments? I agree too. Okay, so the list that we are down to at this point, it will read that the support obligation may be further adjusted by the court pursuant to the specific needs of the child and the economic circumstances of the parents based upon the following factors. A, the special educational needs of the child. B, the legal responsibility of the parents for the support of others. C, the value of services contributed by either parent. D, any public assistance paid to support the child, including Social Security benefits available to the child. E, the cost of transportation of the child to and from visitation. And I would move the relative income of both parents to F and make G the any other necessary expenses for the benefit of the child.
This is Dawn Throne. My notes had said that we also had discussed and I thought agreed upon changing relative income of both parents to relative income of both households to address that issue where there's a voluntary choice to have somebody stay at home because their spouse makes a lot of money.
Good catch, we did, and that's why we need to take a look at this language to make sure we didn't miss on some of those motions we had made. I will make that adjustment to it. Any additional adjustments that we would like to see added? At the moment, we have time as we work through this, but, okay.
Madam Chair, Keith Picker for the record. I just have one quick question. Is what's the rationale for moving the relative income up? Was that just to allow the catch-all to be the last thing?
Because I think the catch-all makes sense at the end. That was the only
Okay.
thought I was
All
having.
right, thank you.
Okay. Ooh, let's move to agenda item number 5 and discuss. We will have discussion and recommendations on proposed language for a minimum child support amount. As I stated earlier, based on our low income chart, the amount goes down to $80. Based on the deviation factors, the court could potentially go below that $80 unless we set a minimum child support value. As we all know, our current statutory language was $100 per month per child. Pursuant to the report on our guideline review, on page 11, she stated that what is typical in the country is $50 per month per order, not per child. We never did conclude what we would want in our state as the minimum and how we would like to state that language because we wanted to see how this chart played out and how the numbers played out and the percentages. But we need to now make a decision as a commission whether or not we're going to set a specific minimum order. Thoughts?
Keith Pickard for the record. I have plenty of thoughts.
Yes, you do.
I personally lean toward, I think every parent should be paying something for their child. And since 80 is the natural minimum in the low-income payers chart, I would be comfortable making it $80 per child. I think $50, if we're talking about a typical household of 3 or 4 kids and it's $50, might as well be zero.
But if you state that, then your chart is already screwed up, Keith, because under that lowest income, For 2 children, your child support comes out to 110, and we've already violated it. If you say per
Okay.
child versus per order.
No, you're right. You're right. All right, well then, $80, I think, should be the minimum no matter what.
Per order. Per
Correct.
month. I tend to agree with that. Yes.
This is Karen Cliff from the DA's office. Just to clarify, if we're stating that the minimum order is 80, and let's say it's 1 child, then are we basically also stating that there's no discretion, no adjustments that will be considered? I mean, if we're at 80 and let's say we have a host of deviation factors, where does that go? Does that mean that range, they're not permitted to receive deviations?
Correct. Well, that's how a minimum order would, statutory order would work, yes. Except with their, yeah, we have the incarceration exception.
Kathleen Baker, for the record, if we're, rather than just doing a minimum, why don't we just look at the monthly income up to $759? If we're talking about using whatever that baseline is at $759, which would be $80 given this chart, and so we just go across the way and we don't bother with the minimum. We say this is where we're at. These are the lowest amounts that can be paid, and then courts can still have some discretion, I think, to adjust if appropriate.
Yeah, which is very similar to what I was going to indicate. We can't say 80 because we like Mr. Ratt said, we end up violating it once you get to 2 children. So if I think we take this chart as it's written, monthly income up to, then there's our statutory minimums across that first line.
I'm comfortable with doing it that way. And it would adjust as that chart adjusts. So we would continue to be realistic and I think fair.
I'm fine with that.
I concur.
I'm fine with that with the caveat that if you have 2 parents that have equal income and have split custody, you may end up with a 0 child support order because they're both at the exact same income level.
Well, except that based on the way our Supreme Court case law plays out, it's not that it's at 0, they each have a child support amount, it's just
I agree.
netting,
I just think,
you're right, there's still a child support calculation, and there's still a value that was owed.
I think as long as the language is clear
Right.
that so long as the court has considered, I'm just saying, if the language is flat out, you have to have a number in the order, then I think there are cases where you don't have to have a number.
But don't we still end up with a different calculation? Because this says income up to $759, so the percent is 10.56%. So if I'm only making $500, my support amount's going to be less than $80 because it's going to be 10.56% of $500.
That's not how I read it. I read it any monthly income up to $759, you're going to pay $80. Anything up to that amount, the way that this is written, your child support would be $80. You wouldn't run the calculation at all on a lower amount. Everything below that amount would be that number, is how I read it.
For public consumption purposes, it's almost easier to take out the percentage column. I mean, that is how Ellen got to that child support amount, but it makes more sense not looking at the percentage and then looking at the up to.
Because they'll do what I did.
They will, because I think you're right.
They will do what I did. The public will do what I did. They'll say 10.56%. So I agree with Ms. Surratt that we would take out the percentage column for public consumption. That would be us.
Right. Sorry, I feel like we're not in compliance with something. Let me take a moment real quick. I want to look at the federal, the CFR
Hey, Kim,
real
this
quick.
is Nova. I'm looking
Yes.
at it right now.
Okay. I'm like, I feel like something's missing.
The new regulation, and I'm not completely in it, I'm looking at the overview, states it's got to be based on the non-custodial parent's earnings, income, and other evidence of ability to pay. So in this case, if the client had zero income and they weren't somebody who was intentionally trying to avoid child support, because that's a different section, but it has to be based on their ability to pay. So if they had no income, do they have an ability to pay the $80? And it's in 302.56C1.
Should ability to pay be a deviation factor? I mean, should we be telling the courts, because that's what we've been directed by the feds all along, that we're supposed to be doing, and it's not clearly stated anywhere. Well, it's foundational, but that makes an assumption that they have the same foundation that we have after we've all read way too much information about child support at this point.
Bridget Robb, for the record, I don't think adding that as a consideration would hurt. It's a reminder.
It makes me feel more comfortable. I don't mind us just not putting in a minimum child support amount. It gives the court, it does give the court that additional flexibility in deviation to say, okay, and if somebody really does not have the ability to pay, anytime we put a minimum in there, we're restricting the court's ability to make that judgment call.
I think that's true. So do we do away with minimums? I know that in the
I think our
section-
chart
in the section
naturally
of the
takes
report-
care of it. I mean, it sets a minimum, but by us not stating there's an absolute minimum, the court could look at that $80 and find enough other deviation factors to say it's not fair in this case.
Yeah, and there's
get rid of
comments
it.
through the report with regard to, and I'm not finding the language, but if they can't pay it, then it doesn't make any sense. Child support orders have to reflect an actual ability to pay. And if the court makes that finding that there's no ability to pay, then are we suggesting that the court can make the finding that there's no child support?
Mr. Sanford?
This is Joe Sanford for the record. I know that we went down this line a little bit earlier when we discussed incarceration and incarcerated parents and some concerns about whether we wanted those to be eligible for zero orders and whether or not those needed to have, for example, a statutory minimum order. And the discussion was had as to whether or not a statutory minimum order that an incarcerated person was ordered to pay despite a finding that they had no income, and whether that would meet the federal guidelines. And my recollection is that the determination was made that if there was a statutory minimum order, that even with a no ability to pay instance, such as incarceration, that would still be a valid order and a valid requirement to pay that. And so my only concern with not having any minimum is that essentially, I guess in a way, basically says that the minimum that incarcerated parents would be set at zero absent a finding that they have outside income.
Our incarceration language that we approved for calculating child support stated, correct, we had put in language set to no less than the minimum child support allowed by law. Of course, we just adjust that. I mean, if we don't have a minimum, then it's okay for it to be at zero.
That would be my understanding if we didn't have a minimum. And I'm not
Or we
advocating
just
either
change
way
that
right now.
language
But
within our incarceration language, right?
But that was I recall that we had this discussion during the incarceration section, and that at that time we discussed, well, we'll have a minimum that we want to have to ensure that the incarcerated people have some obligation to pay some amount for their children even while incarcerated, and so that was my first thought as to why having no set minimum could be problematic.
And I'm looking at page 55 of the report, Exhibit 37, where they've done something similar to what we've done, and left anything below $800 as gross monthly income to the court's discretion.
What page
So it
again?
looks like leaving open. Page 55 of the report, Exhibit 37. Anything below $800, they've just sort of left court discretion there, which I find interesting since they don't like the court to have any discretion. But it looks like it considers going below the minimum, or going below a minimum, if the court can make those findings.
This is Nova for the record, and that report was written before this final regulation came out. So probably this piece of it was not considered when she wrote that.
My preference is that we don't set a minimum, that we leave that to the court's discretion. That we use the formula, or sorry, the table that we've proposed, and if there's additional things for the court to consider, that we don't establish a statutory minimum, but go to that point.
I believe I'm in favor of that too. I think there's just so many circumstances, especially when we go back to looking at all of our deviation factors that give you other reasons why the court has to consider other circumstances and things going on in that household or the two different households, and giving the court the ability to say, whoa, wait, it's not even fair. There's no need for a payment here. Ms. Baker?
In looking at 302.56 C1, it also talks about that the guidelines must provide that if income is imputed, the amount must reflect the specific circumstances of the non-custodial parent to the extent known, may not order a standard amount imposed in lieu of fact gathering in the specific case. And to me, that pretty clearly says judicial discretion.
I just asked Ms. Baker to read it again.
I think the language that's important about it, it says it's sort of the amount that's determined must reflect the specific circumstances of the non-custodial parent to the extent they are known, and may not order a standard amount, which would be the minimum, imposed in lieu of fact gathering in the specific case. So I think that if you have a judge who is looking at the facts of the case and analyzing ability to pay, in any evidence to that effect, then the judge has to make that decision and make the facts that support the finding of child support amount.
Do we have a motion? Judge Hoskin?
Sorry, we were having a side meeting here because the discussion I was having with Ms. Cliff is that very seldom do I see cases that I would be inclined to go below the statutory minimum, but I think the DA's office sees that quite a bit more than I do. But and she's not telling me what she's thinking. But I would make a motion that we do away with the statutory minimum and leave that below the amount that's on our chart to the discretion of the court for those adjustment factors that we've just sort of agreed to, if that motion makes any sense.
Karen Cliff, I'll second that motion.
Okay. Any discussion? Mr. Sanford?
I just want a point of clarification. Would the idea that be that the top of the chart, the first line would be the kind of presumptive amount, and then the deviation factors or whatever would be considered by the court, or that just if you're If you're above that amount, that it's just entirely up to judicial discretion.
That is what I'm presuming, that essentially the $80 is the statutory amount, and the court must make findings in order to deviate from that amount.
Okay, further discussion? All in favor, state aye.
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 Opposed, state nay. Motion passes. I'm going to jump down to our number 11, which is the master document part of this. Just to clarify on the record that we have a need to just assure that that language doesn't get brought back in, because it was part of what was the $100 minimum was deleted out of statute. So with all of us keeping in mind what we give as a final report, I need help from the commission and from the committee in terms of keeping track of that. And we also need to go through some of that original language from the statute to see what we need to bring back in, because what part of that discussion just now was about needing to make specific findings for deviation. That language was part of the statute that was deleted, and we need to bring it back into our master document and not lose that language. And you reminded me of that when you talked about specific findings on that. All right.
Where are we on our master document while we're talking about that? I don't think I've seen one for a couple of meetings.
Yes, it
with the
needs,
changes we've made.
As we've been sitting here, I've been rearranging it and writing on it as we went through those steps. So I will get it reissued to us with everything we just discussed, and get that back out. And what I will propose for that master document, which is really part of our authority, if we look at agenda item number 9, which is regarding the scope of the committee's authority pursuant to AB 278. Under that agenda item, I'm going to propose that that I will go through the language that was deleted out by AB 278 and bring into our master document some of the language that I think we need to maintain. And let me specifically state what some of that is so that this committee knows what I'm talking about. Under AB 278, there is specific language regarding stipulations, and we have that stipulation language that we have been working on. But number 6 was deleted out of 125B080, because all of 080 was deleted, really, that talks about if the amount of the awarded support for child is greater or less than the amount that would be established under the applicable formula, the court shall set forth findings of fact as to the basis for the deviation from the formula. So that the specific language about providing findings of fact, specific findings of fact needing to be laid out for deviation, I need to pull that language back in and not lose it. Now, the reason we have an agenda item talk about AB 278 and the scope of our authority specifically is we got into some debates regarding what we can and cannot do with modification of child support language. When we look at AB 278, Section 2, we took, and we did do something funky at the legislature. Keith, we did a really strange thing because NRS 125B 070 was left intact, which has the percentages in it. Although we then went into 125B 080 and said that the only way child support will be calculated to determine the required support in any case and to change the amount of required support will be pursuant to any regs this commission creates. But we left 070 in statute, just sitting there with the percentages. Correct. So what page are you looking at? Page 8? Yes. So if you go to page 8 of AB 278, we put that if the court, well, this is on modification. So we deleted the definition of gross monthly income for the calculation of child support, which means we need to have a definition of gross monthly income. In the alimony statute, we stated that we gave a specific definition of gross monthly income for alimony. And then we went on to say if there's a modification of child support, if the court has jurisdiction to modify, if they determine they have jurisdiction to modify, and the grounds for modification remained in the statute, which was the 20% change and the every 3 years, that stayed intact in here. Then we said that the modification would utilize the specific gross monthly income definition placed in NRS 125.150. So what we did to ourselves within AB 278 was we said on initial calculation of child support, it's going to be by the definition of gross monthly income established by this commission. But when it's a modification of child support, we made ourselves go back to the definition listed under 125.150. So,
Well, Madam Chair, let me just also point out that
Yes.
125B070 is repealed in Section 13.
This is Amy
Okay,
Crow.
yes.
For the record, and Assemblyman Pickard is correct on the last page.
Okay.
That actually freaked me out initially too. Page 17, Section 13,
Okay.
NRS 125B070 will be repealed upon passage of the regulation. So that part will be
we repealed it, we just didn't line it out within AB 278.
That is correct.
But we still have the modification, gross monthly income problem on
We do.
modification.
I've also got another issue.
Yes?
If you look in NRS 425.360 on page 13 of AB 278, number 3 gives the amount computed to the guidelines established by the administrator to the section, and then it goes on to say using the Nevada average wage determined by the Employment Security Division. So it's talking about that last topic where we established ability to pay and how we're going to determine when somebody doesn't have money. It looks like that might need to come out too. Like a cleanup bill.
Right.
Like an assemblyman does a cleanup bill for us.
Like as soon as the 2019 session starts, we need to clean this up. Yes. So, in that one,
We'll include that in my, it'll be SB, the former AB 167.
okay, so where we sit right now, we as a commission have created a definition of gross monthly income for the calculation of child support because we did delete out a definition for ourselves. We are in conflict with a modification of child support being under a different definition of gross monthly income. But that would be a great thing to go through the 2019
Yeah.
session.
And Madam Chair, I agree that we probably should clean up the language, but I don't think it's a direct contradiction. I don't think that we are violating it. I think that because we have defined gross monthly income, the language says, income from all sources, but I don't know that that necessarily precludes application of the definition. So I think we're probably okay. It is a little clunky once you combine them, but I don't see them as actually in direct conflict.
Ours is just more detailed definition than that all sources, any source language that was within 150.
No, Marie, for the record, I think after we took out those pieces about childcare and the medical piece of it, it made it fit better.
It does. It actually fits a lot better. I agree with that statement. Now, I had somebody argue to me that language regarding stipulations on child support were not proper for this commission, but under section 2 on page 6, where we deleted the language regarding when the parties agree to their child support, it's deleted in contemplation of us being able to replace that language or keep that language and still work with that stipulation language, and we need to keep it or keep the language we agreed to as a committee on stipulations. Now, there is language in number 3 that was deleted out that I think we need to carry over and keep regarding the court requiring the parties to furnish financial information and records and information when they disagree in order for gross monthly income to be determined.
That is a great catch. I agree with that.
And so I had written keep next to that language too. So in creating that master document, I think that is language that needs to be kept. And then we've changed the minimum, which was number 4 that was deleted. Number 5 is a statement that it is presumed that the basic needs of a child are met by the formula set forth in the child support statute. That is language that we probably should keep. Along with that language, I think that is kind of that proper language where it's about ability to pay, the needs of the child, kind of that generic language from the federal regs in their directives to us. And I will put it upon myself to kind of create that language for us. And then the findings of fact language need to stay intact. Now, there is under number 8, if a parent who has an obligation for support is willfully underemployed or unemployed to avoid an obligation for support of a child, the obligation must be based upon the parent's true potential earning capacity. We created within this committee imputation language. An allegation was made to me also that this committee did not have the authority to be dealing with the language for imputation of income, but that's been deleted out of statute with the thought that we would control over the language that was deleted and either recreate it or change it. So I still put forth that I believe we have the authority to deal with imputation of income based on that language. Okay. Any additional conversation to be had about the scope of our authority under AB 278?
Do we have the ability to indicate what's going to be a change of circumstance for review?
Okay, so on review for modifications, the interesting part is at the very front in section 2, the authority that was left with us was 1, to determine the required support in any case involving the support of children, or 2, change the amount of required support of children. However, the language on, if you look at page 8 of AB 278, the language regarding every 3 years for modification and 20% change was left intact. what we were given authority over was the calculations. So what it says, let's see, if you look at the page before, 125B 145 is hereby amended to read, an order for the support of a child must, upon the filing of a request for review by either the division or a parent, be reviewed by the court at least every 3 years pursuant to this section to determine whether the order should be modified or adjusted. Each review conducted pursuant to this section must be in response to a separate request. 2, if the court A does not have jurisdiction to modify, the court may forward the request to any court, or B has jurisdiction to modify the order, and taking into account the best interests of the child, determine that modification or adjustment of the order is appropriate. The court shall enter an order modifying or adjusting the previous order for support in accordance with the guidelines we establish. So the way I read it is no, that we had control over, once the court decides it has jurisdiction to modify, we have control over how it modifies, but not when it has jurisdiction to modify. Excuse me.
Madam Chair, if I may, when this came up and the jurisdictional question was challenged, I went back to my legislative file on AB 278, and I could find no note talking about adjustments. We were focused on the calculations, and so I think that as excited as I was to get into that and to start talking about additional triggers that made sense, in all honesty, I don't think that was contemplated, so I agree with you. I don't think we have the jurisdiction to deal with that here.
I think once the statute allows the modification, it's back in our court on how the modification takes place in terms of the calculation of that modification, but not the grounds for the modification.
But just as to the calculation,
just
not
the calculation.
as to the triggers.
Right. Which really just goes back to the guidelines we're setting in place anyways for calculation of child support. Did I answer your question, Judge? Or did myself and
Not the way that I wanted you to, no.
I know.
I wanted you to tell me something different than that, because and the young lady to my right, I mean, I'm concerned about all the child support orders. I've got 28,000 existing cases. Many of them still have existing child support orders, and this change, my guess is, will result in quite a few motions to modify. Based upon that, I can't even think what the 4D program is going to deal with.
But the current statutory authority you have doesn't say a change in statute is a grounds for modification of child support.
But this is Karen Cliff. So Illinois did a total revision of their child support guidelines, and in doing so, they did enact a provision. And just to sort of keep it short and sweet, it does state the enactment of blah, blah, blah does not in itself constitute a substantial change in circumstances warranting a modification. And I bring this up because whether it's addressed through this commission or it's addressed outside of it through a Senate bill, my hope is that we at least have the discussion, because I do see an influx of modifications happening as a result, because modification is permissible based upon a change of circumstances. Now, one of those changes we know is a 20% change in income, but we also see a variety of changes in circumstances, from children emancipating to children no longer receiving daycare, child care, health insurance, deviations that were previously given a modification, those deviations no longer being an issue. My concern is whether other practitioners and other parties will envision this change, removing a cap, for example, being a change of circumstance, and without the clarification through a regulation that says that it's not a change, my fear is that there will be an enormous influx of modifications.
The statute as written right now, it isn't. So whether or not we can add that as a, like we were talking about, comments for clarification. I mean, my interpretation is that's not every 3 years, and that's not a change, 20% change in gross monthly income. That's a change in circumstances. I mean, we have pretty darn clear case law about change in circumstances.
I think there's a Supreme
but-
Court case, somewhere in the back of my head of us have a Supreme Court case that indicates that a change in the law is a change in circumstance.
Is it?
Well, I can't come up with the case as I'm sitting here today, but
Judge
somewhere
Rob's
in the back
shaking
of
her
my head
head
I
yes,
have that.
too.
Well, then we're both right or we're both wrong. I'd like to think the former.
So,
if what you're telling me is that's not within our purview, then we're wasting time talking about it. We need to push the legislature to do something about that outside of what we're doing here, would be what I'm hearing.
I don't know how to make it fit in there. If you can figure
Okay.
out a way to make it fit into AB 278, I've left it on the agenda because we have such short time frame between, well, I had already put out the agenda for the next meeting by the time we had this meeting, so it's still on the agenda for next time. So what I do, I encourage the committee to all go reread AB 278 again and see if you think you can formulate a way for it to be within our purview for the next meeting.
And I agree with you. Strictly statutorily speaking, I don't think it would qualify as a change of circumstance, but I think that we've got case law, and I'll go back and try and find that before the next meeting too, if I find that there's ability to make any changes.
Okay. Any additional comments about the scope of our authority under AB 278 for now? Other than my directive for everybody to go reread it again, please, with that one consideration. Okay. That was number 9. Technically, that was also agenda number 6, where we talked about proposed language for modification of child support. Let's discuss. Let's do agenda item number 8 real quick, just because it's discussion and recommendations on guidance for the courts regarding how to calculate a deviation for additional dependents in the home. I would propose that having our adjustment factor regarding responsibility for the support of others deals with that issue, and I don't know that this committee needs to entertain anything additional at this time. I do think that's probably going to be something that this committee re-entertains after July 1st with some additional thought into how to deal with that in the future. It will show up on another agenda because, again, like I said, I'm having to put agendas out before we have meetings to even adjust the agenda, so it will stay there for a little bit longer. Any further discussion on that? Agenda item number 7. Our Achilles heel. We're really finally got to the point where we can say we've got some percentages and some numbers. So, do we have additional comments? Anybody ready to discuss and make recommendations on language for shared, split, and/or serial parenting? I know Keith and Judge Hoskin, you had done some work on prior language. We didn't get anywhere with it. What's everybody's thoughts on this now?
As I recall, we circulated it and then tabled it and never had a conversation on it. I don't have it right in front of me, however.
I think it's worth a nice complete meeting on with good preparation. So my thought for the commission right now is we came a long ways on really getting our standard language done right now. I'll get a nice clean master document out to us based on everything we just did. I think now's the time between now and the next few meetings that everybody leave knowing our entire goal is talking on this agenda item on shared, split, and serial parenting and actual language. If you would, Keith, I believe it's posted, or I know it's posted on the DWSS site, but let's get that language recirculated and everybody leave knowing what our base calculations are now, and really put your heart and soul into some research and some thought into our case law, into ideas and suggestions on that topic of shared, split, and serial parenting.
Yes, ma'am, I'll get that out.
Okay, thank you. Additional comments on that from the committee? Anybody disagree with me? That that's really the focus between now and July 1st, something that we really got to hone in on. We're going to be fine-tuning our language on everything else and making sure we have it right, but that is our, this is what we've got to accomplish over the next month. Okay. Agenda item number 12, discuss and approve ideas for future agenda items. Our next meeting is based on the same agenda, so I could get something on there after that if anybody has anything to throw out there that I have totally missed or isn't covered by any of these agenda items that are on here. The next meeting, Joy, is June 4th. And it's at 1 p.m. also. And we have the legislature. Okay. All right. Hearing no other comments, we will move on to public comment.
Before you do that.
Yes, Judge.
Could I ask you to look at number 3? I wasn't here when you approved it. In the minutes, I was not absent. And then I know it's just a typographical, but in the heading on pages 2 through 25, it says meeting minutes April 27th. That should have been meeting minutes May 4th.
Okay, we had a motion and a second and approval. Will you make that a motion to amend that?
I would.
Okay, and a second?
Second.
And for discussion, Joy, are you clear on what the edit was for the minutes? Okay. And all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, motion passes. Okay. Is there anybody in Las Vegas that would like to give public comment? Is there anybody over the phone that would like to give public comment? Is there anybody in Carson City that would like to give public comment? Hearing none, we close that agenda item, and I will take a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? All right, motion carries. And we will see everybody on June 4th at 1 o'clock and at the 2 legislative buildings. Thank you.